Welcome to the Perimenopause Playbook, a place where we explore the fascinating intersection of neuroscience and interior design to support the cognitive health of women in perimenopause and menopause. I am Lola Ajayi, an interior designer on a mission to share my findings on neuroscience for interior design with protocols and ideas that support and enhance the cognitive well-being of women during this transformative stage of life. Join me as we delve into the fascinating world of neuroscience for interior design and discover how we can create spaces that nurture and empower women during this important time. Let's design supportive spaces for a healthier mind, a healthier body, and a healthier soul together.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Perimenopause Playbook. This is episode 9, and today we are diving into a concept that is very often overlooked, but it does have a significant impact on your mental clarity and emotional balance, and that is liminal spaces, also commonly known as thresholds. And a quick one before we dive into it. Just in case I either cough or I sound like a gremlin, I know that. It's because it's autumn here and it's beautiful. However, it packs a punch on my upper respiratory tract, so I will sound like a gremlin throughout the throughout the podcast, but it needs to be done. So here we are. Anyway, that's aside. I was saying that so liminal spaces are everywhere. So think about when you start your day, you wake up in your bedroom, yes, and then you get out of bed, and then so your bedroom is sort of like the space where you rest and relax and everything, and then you cross into your kitchen if that's the first thing you do, or if you have a gym in your space and that's the first thing you do, you're transitioning from one mental state to another. That is from a sleep and rest state of mental awareness into another state of mental awareness. And that transition from one functional zone to the other is what we call transition spaces. And it doesn't just exist in residential spaces, it exists in anywhere there's space, interior or exterior spaces. A very common example, case in point, for liminal spaces and exterior spaces is if you live in a city where you've got high rises and there's a hustle and bustle there, and then it's interspersed by these quiet spaces where you have green spaces like a park, for instance. That sort of transition from the hustle and bustle of city life, even if the park is surrounded by it, once you enter into that space, the act of transitioning into that park space is the liminal sort of space, the transition space. And it could be a doorway, it could be a hallway, name it. We're going to dive into all of the different types of liminal spaces and how we can leverage it to better support your cognitive health. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to establish the relevance of thresholds, both cognitively and emotionally. And then we'll discuss the neuroscience. There's going to be neuroscience in the entire podcast, but we're going to start with a bit of neuroscience of threshold spaces. And then we're going to talk about how sensory cues influence our cognitive health and how we can use them in liminal spaces. Then we talk about how these spatial transitions can affect our emotional energy and how we regulate our emotions. And then we'll finish off with practical applications on how we can, actionable steps that we can use to optimize these transitions in our residential spaces. Because my service is dedicated to residential spaces and how it supports our cognitive health. We're not going to be talking about liminal spaces in office spaces or liminal spaces in public space. So yes, let us dive in. So, like as I established earlier, they're not just physical spaces. These are, when leveraged correctly, they are powerful points of transition that influence the way that we think, the way that we feel, and the way that we function throughout our day. So let's dive into a bit of interior design terminology. So threshold spaces, they refer to the physical and often transitional areas that connect to different spaces or zones or environments within a building. And as I said earlier, between buildings, if it's exterior spaces or between sort of zones of activities in exterior spaces. And there's so many spaces that fit into this descriptive, so much so that we never think about it in terms of how important they are in the way that our mental states are influenced. And these spaces, for example, we have doorways, we have landings, we have entrances, we have corridors, we have stairwells, and these serve as intermediaries between rooms or zones in interior spaces, and they often mark a shift in function, atmosphere, or experience. So why is it important? There are four reasons why I have identified it's important to think about the way that we design the spaces, regardless of the size or the style of your interior. The first is the transition of purpose. So transition spaces facilitate movement between different areas that serve different purposes, such as, for instance, when you're transitioning from a busy kitchen to a quiet living room, or when you're moving from an entrance hall to a private bedroom, for instance, or like me, when I was growing up, we shared bathroom facilities with my siblings, and the fact that I moved from my bedroom through a hall space to the shared facility, that's for me was the transition, and that's the space that connected my bedroom to the bathroom. That's the liminal space. Those are examples of liminal or transition spaces. For the purpose of this episode, we're going to use threshold spaces or transition spaces. Yeah. So that's the first reason. The second reason that I identified is they facilitate our cognitive and emotional shifts. So these spaces are usually, when it's intentionally designed, they are used to help people mentally and emotionally transition between activities or environments or moods. And we do this by using elements in the design scheme to encourage this. And we'll look at the ways to use this to our advantage later on in the episode. The third reason is to maintain flow and energy in space. So in design philosophy, the first design philosophy that comes to mind readily is feng shui. So in feng shui, threshold spaces are so important for maintaining the flow of energy or qi through the home space. And if these areas are cluttered or poorly designed, they disrupt the energy balance of the space. And finally, for aesthetic and functional reasons. So thresholds are functional, but they're not just for that reason. They are also aesthetically significant because the brain translates and decodes and interprets beauty, and so threshold spaces often serve as spaces that introduce stylistic elements that either unite the transition space you're passing through to the connecting space, or it signals a deliberate change. That's, for instance, an entryway. When you're transitioning from the outside to the inside, that landing area is a significant change from your outdoor space to your indoor space. So if we're thoughtful and intentional about the design of these often overlooked spaces, we will start to see enhanced overall functionality and flow and atmosphere in the home. And another really cool thing is that I discovered is that every time that you transition between spaces in the home, the brain undergoes a subtle reset. Did you? Well, I didn't know this until I started doing research. So I'm assuming that you don't know that either. And this phenomenon becomes especially relevant during peri and postmenopause. And it's relevant because hormonal fluctuations and changes, the ups and downs and the dips and spikes in our estrogen levels, they influence our cognitive functions, like our focus and our emotional regulation. So we need to understand the neuroscience behind that inform these transitions and use it to apply thoughtful interior design principles. And by doing this, we create a living environment that supports our mental clarity, our emotional well-being, and even our spiritual grounding if you're into that. So imagine if imagine, think about your space or spaces that you've walked into. If you've ever felt calmer, more alert, or even a little disoriented when moving from one space to another, you have experienced the impact of crossing a threshold. And so it's really important to pay attention to this space moving forward. And so today I'm going to break down why that happens, and I'll also discuss strategies that we can leverage in these spaces to help us enhance and support cognitive and overall health. All right, now let's dive into the fascinating world of neuroscience and discover how your brain responds to threshold spaces. So, the brain's ability to shift focus when it's transitioning between physical spaces is deeply rooted in neuroscience. Think about when you move from one room to another. Your brain, what's happening in your brain is that it engages regions like the entorhinal cortex and the hippocampus. I hope I pronounced entorhinal cortex properly. And these two areas in your brain are critical for spatial memory and cognitive mapping. Now, research from University College London's Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience they showed that these physical transitions act as cognitive reset points, and these allows the brain to recalibrate its focus and its attention. And of course, as usual, links to relevant research is in the show notes. So, a couple of practical tips that we can apply today to help with this reset is the first thing that, and I know I've mentioned it so many times, but it bears repeating over and over and over again because it's so important, is to unclutter your doorway. So your brain, it has a natural reset function. So use that natural brain reset function to your advantage. Keep your doorways clear of clutter in order to harness this function and to improve your focus. So a clutter-free and open threshold obviously allows your brain to process the transition with fewer distractions, which makes it then easier to shift your focus. So a quick idea that you can use today is to remove unnecessary items from your doorways. Like, for instance, my entryway used to have shoes everywhere. And over time, I started to notice like little micro irritations when I walk into my space and my door bumps into shoes, or I'm bumping into shoes, and I needed to create a more like cohesive looking feeling space. So I leveraged the use of storage solutions to put my shoes in, and now my doorway is clear of clutter, and this has by far improved my coming home experience just by decluttering my entryway. So remove those unnecessary items from your doorways and use built-in storage to reduce your clutter. And the neuroscience insight on this is clear. Clutter creates cognitive overload, which forces the brain to work harder to navigate the environment, and which would inevitably lead to mental fatigue. Now let's look at how sensory cues like lighting, or the use of texture, and the introduction of soundscapes can influence brain function as you move through your interior spaces. So, research from MIT's Pikawa Institute of Learning and Memory has shown that subtle changes in sensory inputs help the brain manage cognitive load. So, in essence, when the brain senses a shift in your environment, either subtle or to your face, it filters out irrelevant sensory information, which allows for an effective response. And this allows you to refocus and to manage tasks a bit more efficiently. Because of the unique endocrinological changes and nuances that happen in peri and postmenopause, it is crucial for us to be mindful that our bodies are more susceptible to sensory overload. So abrupt or disorganized transitions between sensory environments, like, for instance, a super bright hallway that leads into a super dimly lit room, will result in brain fog or even disorientation or anxiety levels. So the first thing that we should consider is lighting design. So we talked about lighting so much already, but it does have a significant effect on how your brain responds to different environments and sensory inputs. So for instance, if you can afford it, there's this system they call circadian lighting, and what this does is it simulates the transition of day this the gentle transition of daytime to nighttime, and this supports our brain's natural rhythms in our interior spaces. So this circadian lighting concept changes intensity and color temperatures throughout the day, and it has been proven as a method for improving cognitive function. So how can you introduce this in your interior space? We start with, like, imagine how dawn begins. So a soft, cool lighting that gets significantly brighter throughout the day and peaks in the middle of the day, which then sort of transitions to softer and warmer tones in the evening. So in your interior space, you could interpret this way. Use cooler and brighter lighting in spaces where you need to focus, like in your kitchen or your home office. And the transition spaces towards that could have like if you're moving from your bedroom space and you're going and you're passing through a corridor or to get to your workspace, sort of like the lighting scheme and the color scheme, the intensity and the way that like the combination of color and light uh, impacts your brain should gently transition you to a brighter um, space, like a kitchen or your home office, as I mentioned. And if you're transitioning into, say, like a space that is used for sleeping or relaxation, then it should transition softly from like a brighter sort of lighting scheme to a softer, warmer lighting scheme. And that's the best way to signal your brain to wind down. And the neuroscience support that show studies from Chronobiology International, where they reveal that cooler lighting boosts serotonin levels, which in turn promotes alertness, and conversely, softer lighting triggers melatonin production, which promotes relaxation and sleep. So let me backtrack here on how we can use even if you cannot afford to install a circadian lighting system in your space, just using dimmer switches is very helpful. So if, for instance, you're just waking up in the morning and you're going into your kitchen, so you have soft lighting in your bedroom space, your bedside lamp, and low level lighting. Even if you have that switched on, it's low level lighting, and you're transitioning into, say, your kitchen. If, for instance, you're passing through a hallway, have your hallway lighting on dimmer switches, or use low level lighting like perimeter lighting, for instance. That's not direct in the eye, but it sort of helps your brain adjust to brighter lighting levels, and that you will find would reduce levels of anxiety because your brain is not inundated by sudden bright lighting. It's the logic is pretty clear, but I mean, we need to have the neuroscience to support that in order to prove that this actually is what happens when we are like introducing in sudden bright lighting into our eyes, and this is what happens when we do that. It affects our cognitive and mental clarity. So that's that on lighting levels. So let's talk about tactile transitions and how it helps our mental functions. So texture, I find, is a really crucial element for grounding our cognitive functions and our mind when we're moving through different spaces. So when we engage our tactile senses, sort of like walking through spaces by using different textures on the walls, floors, ceiling, like rugs and woven fabrics and natural materials like stone or stone textures on the walls, the flooring, or materials that we can touch and interact with. This provides a sense of security and mental grounding during transition spaces. And this is a simple fact that works every time. So how can we do that? I'm going to give an example of my space as well. So my entry, which is like for me, it's the transition into my space because I live in a small apartment. So my entryway is not cluttered, it's decluttered. There's soft lighting that I can just flip on. It's low level lighting. Um, it's not overhead lighting. I don't use the overhead lighting in my entryway. It's always like low level lighting, so it's not direct in my eyes. And I have a runner rug, that is made from coir, like a soft coir, and it's visually sort of abstract. That's what I prefer. I'm more of I'm more of a plain color person, but if I have to use visual texture, it's usually more abstracty as opposed to heavy patterns on the flooring. So, like an abstract textured flooring, my walls are neutral shades and I have low level lighting. So back to the use of tactility, my rug, the texture on the foot is so grounded for me. As soon as I step into my hallway, I have my low level lighting and I take my shoes off. I put them away, just a ritual of putting my shoes away to prevent visual overload and then stepping onto my very beautiful textured tactile rug is very, very grounding for me. So yeah, so you could do that in your space, or also think about in your space what is unique to how you would love to transition into your home space and adapt that, or talk to your interior designer if you're hiring one. And it's very important to just sort of discuss the things that bring you joy, the things you found grounding, but it does take a lot of intention to understand that so you can communicate that to your interior designer if you're using one, or to leverage that in how you curate your space moving forward. Now, the third thing is sound. Sound is an essential element that can either overload your senses if it's too much and too sharp or not the type that you identify with, or it could guide you smoothly through transition spaces. So, using calm, controlled sounds such as wind chimes at an entryway or soft ambient music in hallways, they help create a sensory bridge which makes cognitive transition easier. So, a case in point would be to incorporate soft, natural sounds in transition areas to reduce overstimulation and also allow your brain to reset. So, I, for instance, use subliminal sounds. That's nature sounds, like sound machines, subtle music, or natural elements like what a water feature. Come to think of it, a water feature is what I've been scouring the internet for the ideal water feature that I can introduce into my spaces. And it's not a maybe, it's an absolute definite. Like the sound of water over rocks, I find it extremely soothing, and I know it will be a game changer once I introduce that into my space. So yeah, so ambient music is a great way to introduce um, sound to calm your senses as you transition through spaces, or nature sounds, water sounds, and that usually stays plugged in, so the sound is like consistent throughout the day. You don't have to wait until you get indoors into your space to turn it on. It's sort of a welcoming sound that helps you transition into your space. And the research of that is, I found a rating that says that shows auditory processing reveals that continuous background noises overwhelm the brain, and by continuous background noises that aren't welcome are, for me, for instance, are the sound of just traffic and cars honking. Just so overwhelms my brain, but controlled sound directs my attention and reduces my sensory overload. So, in order to prevent that, again, um, this is not relevant. I mean, it's not 100% relevant to transitions. It is relevant to transition spaces actually, because when you're transitioning from the outside to the inside, using your, sort of the barriers to the outside world, like double glazed windows, is highly effective for filtering out unwanted sounds, and then using those natural sounds that is controlled by you to help you transition into your space and stay cognitively on the level in your interior spaces. So that's that on the impact of sensory cues on our cognitive health through the use of transitional space design. So not only do transitions between spaces influence our cognitive health, they also play a key role in emotional regulation. And the brain regions are responsible for managing our emotions, like the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. These two, they process environmental changes, and they use these cues to reset our emotional state. And these spatial transitions, when it's leveraged correctly, they offer a really unique opportunity to reset our emotional cadence. So, according to research from the Mind Brain Behavior Interfaculty Initiative at Harvard, shows that transitions between physical environments helps the brain manage emotional energy by signaling a shift from one emotional state to another. For example, when you leave a stressful work environment and you enter a calm living room, this transition provides, you'll notice an instant mental and emotional reset, and you can use the design of your home's threshold spaces to facilitate these emotional resets throughout the day. So I feel like I've established that designing thresholds with intention is really key to managing your emotional energy. In feng shui, I'm segueing into using being intentional about design for to facilitate emotional transitions in our interior spaces. And the most common design philosophy is feng shui, but there are other spiritual and psychological design principles that we could talk about for. Let's talk about feng shui because it's the most popular and the one that you would more readily identify with. So back to feng shui. In feng shui, thresholds are seen as portals where the life force energy or chi flows. So if you allow clutter to block your energy flow, it will become stagnant, it will lead to feelings of frustration or confusion. And these are symptoms that we experience during perimenopause. And it's not, I mean, because we're talking about perimenopause here, but everybody on every spectrum, male or female, would experience this when there's clutter. But because of the unique endocrinological issues that we're experiencing in peri and postmenopause, it's even more heightened for this demographic. So, a design idea that you can introduce today is to place grounded elements near your doorways or your entryways, such as for me, I have plants not in my entryway directly, but my line of sight down my hallway, I can see my giant monstera, and that for me is a grounding element. And as I mentioned earlier, water features as well that I'm in the market for, and using soft low-level lighting as well is amazing at grounding our us emotionally. And this reminds our brain to reset emotionally as we move between, different spaces. And in neuroscience, the support that shows that grounding elements serve as visual and emotional cues, which signal the brain to take a pause and reset emotionally. And the studies at Harvard suggest that these moments of pause, they help the brain manage stress and emotional overload better. So let's talk about energetic flow for emotional balance. I've been talking about the energetics of transition spaces for the past 2 weeks, 12 days on social media, that's TikTok and Instagram. If you're not already following, I encourage you to follow because there's bite-sized resources on my TikTok and Instagram. It's the same thing, TikTok or Instagram, but you can go there for sort of actionable bite-sized interior design informed by neuroscience design tips that you can use right now. So let's go back to energetic flow for creating emotional balance in our threshold spaces. So when we ensure that these spaces, particularly our hallways and entryways, allow for smooth energy flow, our emotional balance is better supported. So again, open and uncluttered spaces make it easier for energy to flow and by extension for emotional states to move freely. So I've mentioned to declutter. We're constantly decluttering, and use open designs in hallways to encourage a smooth flow of energy, and also introduce items like mirrors to reflect light and create a sense of space if your hall is particularly narrow, because claustrophobia also, if you're sensitive to that, um, can overload you cognitively. And so, yeah, so if you have a narrow hallway, using intelligent use of lighting levels and mirrors to reflect light and create a sense of space is very helpful. And in neuroscience, research on that to buttress that point shows studies on spatial design, highlighting that open and well-lit spaces, and by well-lit spaces, they don't mean brightly lit spaces, just well-lit spaces. They help to regulate your brain's emotional responses by reducing feelings of confinement, feelings of stress or agitation. So yeah, so think about that. Let's think about that intentionally and start to look for ways that we can reduce cognitive overload. Before we move on to practical applications, I have not mentioned another key element, which is the use of color in transition spaces. So color is very powerful as a tool for managing both our cognitive and emotional states. I've talked about color in previous episodes where we know that bright colors in the spectrum of reds and oranges are stimulating to the brain, and cool colors in the spectrum of blues and greens and neutrals are relaxing to the brain. According to the Color Association of the United States, different hues can stimulate the brain to either activate or relax. Warm colors, like I said earlier, like reds and oranges, are energizing, and cooler tones like blues and greens and neutrals have a calming effect. So, yeah. So I'm not sure how to proceed with giving you design ideas for using color to transition, but I'm going to try. So when you use, I'm going to give a case in point. So you're going from your dining room, your living room to your dining room to your kitchen, right? So your living room is usually a calming space, like a place where you relax and you just sort of connect with your family. It's more like a chill space. Your dining room has a bit of activity going on and it connects to your kitchen, which is like an activity zone. So if you've got like an open plan concept, for instance, and you're going to your kitchen. So you're transitioning from that calming mental state. You're going to pass through your dining space, which is sort of like a quasi activity zone. There's still a bit of like calming activity where you're eating, you're connecting with your family, but into your kitchen space, which is like activity, all the time. If it's just specifically for cooking, there are some kitchen designs that encourage sort of bits of relaxation, bits of working, bits of stuff. But let's just go the conventional route of the kitchen as an activity zone. So that transition space could be your dining space. So keeping the theme of like a calming tone, but introducing pops of color that sort of start to trigger areas of your brain, preparing it for activity, and then transitioning that and linking that color scheme to your kitchen color scheme would be a great way to use your dining space as your transition space as well as an activity space. It's a little complicated, but I hope you get the point. And neuroscience insight to support that is that the human brain, our brains respond to color signals via the visual cortex, which then influences our emotional state. So again, using these color signals to anticipate the brain to the activity that's going to happen in the next room that you're going into is really interesting to think about. And it's a bit more complicated, but it's not so complicated when you approach it from an intentional perspective, when you itemize, you understand what the space is for, and then you narrow it down from there. And if it gets too complicated for you, you can always hire an interior designer and communicate your desires to them. Interior designers are designed and specialized in the ability to use color to articulate language and function and hopefully help you cognitively as well. So now that we've talked about color, let us explore how we can put these practices and articulate them in your own home. So you can transform these often overlooked transition spaces into tools that support mental clarity and emotional balance by integrating thoughtful design strategies, intuitive design strategies, especially during us peri and postmenopausal people. So this step-by-step guide I'm about to share will show you how to optimize your home thresholds to foster better cognitive and emotional health. Step one, identify key transition areas. So start by walking through your home and note down the areas where you experience these transitions. This is going to take a bit of, a zen feeling to sort of take your time to get a feel for what happens to you when you're transitioning through these spaces, but it will be well worth the effort that you make, trust me. So these are places that you absolutely need to focus on. So think about your entryways, think about your hallways, your doorways, or even your stair landings. These are your primary threshold spaces. A tip here is to observe how you feel when you're moving between spaces and rooms and identify which spaces feel calming and which feel disorienting. And by identifying the emotional and cognitive shifts that happen in these spaces, you're able to guide your design choices moving forward. Step two is to optimize the sensory elements in your space. So each threshold space must include thoughtful sensory cues. And thoughtful sensory cues that it can include are, as I mentioned earlier, our lighting, color, texture, and sound. And these sensory changes will help guide your brain and your emotions as a consequence as you transition between these spaces in your home. So, for instance, your lighting, like I mentioned, cool, bright lights activate areas that promote focus, and warmer, dimmer lightings are great for areas that are meant for relaxation. And the transition between those two, so it's like lower level lighting, perimeter lighting, dimmer switches, and so forth. You can leverage all of that in the use of curating how you transition through these spaces. So the next is texture. And like I mentioned earlier, textured materials like rugs, woven fabrics, and natural elements also help to ground the mind and the body as they move from space to space. And lastly, the use of sound. I've mentioned it earlier about, incorporate soft ambient sounds and so forth. You choose. There's a whole world of ambient sounds that you can introduce that speaks to you to help you transition. Step three is clear the clutter. I've mentioned it before, but it is crucial to eliminate clutter from your environment and not just your hallways, your space in general, because transition spaces are not just hallways and stairwells. There's so many transition spaces. Even as I mentioned earlier, when you're moving from your dining to your kitchen space, if you've got a dining space that punctuates your living room and your kitchen space, that's a transition space, and it's useful as a function and as a transition space. So, thinking broadly about spaces within spaces as transition spaces is also helpful as well. So when you have too much clutter, your brain has to work a lot harder to transition between these tasks or these environments, which makes it harder to focus. So keep these areas free of unnecessary objects to ensure your smooth transition in between them, both cognitively and energetically. So a pro tip here would be use built-in storage solutions or decorative shelving to store items while keeping threshold areas visibly clean and open. Step four is to use color strategically. So using color transitions to signal mental and emotional shifts are so cool as a tool to use. And I've mentioned cool tones, I've mentioned cool tones like blues and greens that promote calm, warm tones that are more activating to your brain. Using them intuitively is very, very helpful. And step five is incorporating grounded elements. So threshold spaces, think of them as opportunities to reset both mentally and emotionally. So plants, water features, soft lighting, they're all excellent ways to ground yourself and slow you down or rev you up, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. So today, I hope that I'm able to prove to a point that something or spaces as simple as doorways or hallways or other interstitial threshold spaces can have a real profound impact on your cognitive and emotional well-being. If we leverage the science of thresholds to create homes that support mental clarity and emotional balance, we would have created an amazing game changer for us moving forward. If we transform our homes into spaces that promote mental clarity and reduces stress, we're able to enhance our emotional regulation. with just simple tools that would elevate our everyday living. And our spaces are non-negotiables, I believe, because these are spaces that we use to regenerate, to recover, to recalibrate before we face the days ahead of us. So it is really important to use these tools to enhance our cognitive health. So when these threshold spaces are designed with intention, they become these functional tools for managing cognitive transitions and emotional energy intelligently. So apply these simple yet very effective strategies to create a living environment that supports you through these emotional shifts and changes that come with peri and postmenopause. And this will promote not just physical comfort, but also your mental focus and emotional balance. So there you have it, guys. Threshold spaces. I hope that you found it really helpful. I've had fun researching and I've learned so much in the course of this past 12 days of doing the research and making the posts on my social media. And I hope that if you're on my social media platforms, you found them insightful and helpful as well. And if you've just been listening to the podcast, I hope you found this episode insightful and helpful as well. So until next time, stay well, be well, stay tuned, and stay awesome. Bye.